In the summer of 1918, deep within the Ural Mountains, gunfire echoed through the basement of the Ipatiev house. The Romanov dynasty, the centuries-old ruling family of Russia, was said to have met its end there. For decades, that night stood as a grim punctuation mark in Russian history. But buried among the chaos of war and revolution, there were whispers. Whispers that not all the Romanovs perished. 2 decades later, as Europe burned once more, those whispers resurfaced in the most unlikely of places. The files of British intelligence. Within the archives of MI6, analysts pieced together fragments of a strange story. A collection of intercepted letters, coded transmissions, and post-war testimonies from Russian émigrés scattered across Europe. What they uncovered would challenge one of history's most accepted truths. The documents dated back to 1939, just as the world teetered on the edge of another global conflict. Among them was a memorandum from a field officer stationed in Warsaw, detailing an encounter with an aging nobleman who claimed direct contact with a surviving heir to the Romanov bloodline. The man spoke of a clandestine evacuation from Yekaterinburg in the chaos of the Bolshevik advance, a rescue conducted under the fog of the Russian Civil War. At first, British officials dismissed it as rumor until the name Vorovsky appeared in a later communication, matching an alias used by a known Bolshevik double agent. At the time, Britain had little reason to dig deeper. Stalin's Soviet Union, though distrusted, was not yet an enemy. But when the Second World War erupted and alliances shifted, so did the value of history's forgotten ghosts. If a surviving Romanov could be found, or even believed to exist, he could serve as a symbol powerful enough to fracture Soviet loyalty or rally anti-communist forces. And in the high-stakes world of intelligence, symbols were sometimes as dangerous as armies. By 1940, with the fall of France and the Nazi occupation of Europe, British intelligence began cataloguing rumours that flowed through the émigré networks of Paris and Berlin. Former aristocrats, diplomats, and even exiled generals spoke in hushed tones of a Romanov in hiding, protected by white Russian sympathizers. The fragments were inconsistent, different names, different fates, but all pointed toward the same unsettling conclusion. Something about the official Soviet story didn't add up. One report, declassified decades later, described a meeting in Istanbul between an MI6 officer and a Russian priest who claimed to have administered last rites to a Romanov child many years after the family's supposed execution. The priest's credibility was uncertain, but his knowledge of the Ipatiev house and its occupants was disturbingly precise. He described injuries and details not released to the public until the 1970s. As the world prepared for total war, such intelligence carried immense weight. The British Foreign Office noted that if a legitimate Romanov claimant were alive, Hitler could use him as a puppet to undermine Stalin's legitimacy. This was more than a historical curiosity. It was a potential geopolitical weapon. Within Whitehall, senior officials debated the implications. Could this be disinformation from Nazi Germany meant to sow mistrust between the Allies? Or was there truly an undiscovered survivor whose existence might upend the fragile wartime alliance forming against the Axis? An internal MI6 directive, classified under the file name Operation Legacy, ordered quiet verification of all related claims. Agents were instructed to trace émigré movements from 1918 to 1939, focusing on escape routes through Finland, Crimea, and the Black Sea. The goal wasn't recovery, it was control. Any hint of Romanov survival had to be verified, contained, or, if necessary, erased before it became a weapon of propaganda. As one intelligence memo put it, "The dead must remain dead, for the living to win the war." Yet, even as MI6 tried to bury the story, it refused to die. Reports continued to flow from occupied Europe, describing mysterious figures of Russian descent moving through resistance networks. In one case, a Gestapo file recovered after the war mentioned a Nikolai Romanov, detained briefly in Paris under suspicion of espionage, then released under pressure from high-ranking German officials. His subsequent disappearance only deepened the intrigue. For historians, this might have been an interesting footnote, had it not been for what came next. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the question of Russia's royal ghosts took on a deadly new significance. British and American intelligence, desperate to understand the fractured loyalties of Eastern Europe, reopened the Romanov file. The idea that a surviving heir could be used or exposed to manipulate wartime politics now became a real strategic concern. What began as a historical rumor was about to evolve into a covert investigation that spanned from London to Stockholm, and from Finland's frozen forests to the ruins of Stalingrad. And in the shadowy world of intelligence, truth was often the first casualty. The mystery that started in a Siberian basement would soon find its way onto the front lines of the Second World War, where the ghosts of the past would collide with the survival of nations. As one British agent wrote in his post-war memoir, history has a way of burying its own secrets. The Romanovs were supposed to be dead, but sometimes history refuses to let the dead rest. The files were marked confidential, subject to review, and as the war escalated, MI6 would learn that some legends, no matter how improbable, could not be ignored. Next, the story moves north to neutral Sweden in 1941, where the first coded messages reignited the question that no one dared to answer: what if the Romanovs had escaped? By the summer of 1941, the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, was in full motion. From the Baltic coast to the steppes of Ukraine, German divisions surged eastward in a campaign of annihilation. But far from the front lines, in the neutral calm of Stockholm, British intelligence intercepted a transmission that would ignite one of the strangest investigations of the war. The coded message, traced through a courier network operating under the guise of a shipping consortium, referenced the Eagle of Tobolsk, a name long forgotten but eerily connected to the Romanov family's past. The decrypt landed on the desk of Commander Wilfred Dunderdale, the urbane and enigmatic MI6 liaison to Sweden. Dunderdale, rumoured to have inspired Ian Fleming's James Bond, was no stranger to strange tales, yet even he was intrigued. The sender appeared to be part of a small circle of Russian exiles in Stockholm who called themselves the White Fellowship. According to the intercepted text, they claimed to possess proof of a surviving Romanov heir, someone being courted by Nazi intelligence as a propaganda tool against Stalin. The implications were staggering. If the Nazis could produce a living Romanov, they could portray their invasion not as conquest, but as liberation, the restoration of a legitimate Russian monarchy against Bolshevik tyranny. British analysts, still unsure of Stalin's long-term loyalty to the Allied cause, feared such a maneuver could drive a wedge between London and Moscow at a critical moment. Thus began one of MI6's most delicate wartime inquiries, to determine whether the Eagle of Tobolsk was a Nazi fabrication or a ghost from Russia's royal past. To investigate, the Special Operations Executive, SOE, Britain's covert sabotage and espionage branch, dispatched a small team under the direction of Captain Peter Fleming, the brother of Ian Fleming and a seasoned intelligence officer stationed in Norway. Working alongside American liaison Major John Haskell of the OSS, Fleming's task was to make quiet contact with the White Fellowship, evaluate their claims, and, if possible, trace the origin of the rumour back into occupied Europe. Their route took them first through Finland, a country caught precariously between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Helsinki, by 1941, was a city alive with spies. German Abwehr agents, Soviet informants, and Allied operatives all stalked the same streets, their loyalties veiled behind diplomacy and deception. Fleming and Haskell posed as members of the British legation, using the cover of trade negotiations to arrange a discreet meeting with a man known only as Colonel Sidorov, allegedly a white Russian military attaché from the old Tsarist regime. Sidorov claimed to have met a man in Berlin in 1939 who identified himself as Mikhail Alexandrovich, a name associated with the Tsar's youngest brother. The man, he insisted, carried a signet ring bearing the Romanov double-headed eagle, engraved with the words "Snami Bog," God is with us. He was later smuggled to Finland via the Arctic route under the protection of a German officer sympathetic to monarchist causes. The trail went cold thereafter, but Sidorov remained convinced that the individual was being kept somewhere in German-occupied territory, waiting to be unveiled at the right political moment. The account was too detailed to dismiss outright, but far too convenient to trust. British analysts in Bletchley Park, upon reviewing the transcripts, noted linguistic anomalies in Sidorov's phrasing that hinted at possible German coaching. Too precise to be authentic, one linguist scribbled in the margin. Still, Fleming pressed on, driven by a nagging sense that the truth might be buried under competing layers of deception. In his field diary, later recovered after the war, Fleming wrote, "In espionage, myth has currency. Sometimes it's the myth, not the fact, that alters the course of war." Meanwhile, in Berlin, Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda had quietly begun drafting materials celebrating the restoration of Russia's true heritage under Nazi occupation. Photographs of Russian Orthodox priests blessing German troops in Smolensk circulated through occupied territories. To the British, it seemed that Hitler's regime was preparing the ground for something bigger, a symbolic figurehead to rally the disillusioned and the devout. Could that figurehead be a living Romanov? Throughout late 1941 and into early 1942, MI6 and the OSS maintained a tight watch on communications passing through Sweden. Several dispatches mentioned a northern refuge and a guardian of imperial blood. The references were vague but persistent. Then, in February 1942, an encrypted German cable from Königsberg mentioned Project Waldkönig, the Forest King, describing it as a tool for political reconstruction in the East. The description matched, almost verbatim, phrases from the earlier Stockholm transmissions. British analysts were now convinced the Germans were nurturing a psychological weapon, a fabricated royal survivor to manipulate occupied Russia. Yet, among the forged intelligence, a handful of documents bore peculiar authenticity, wax seals from pre-revolutionary estates, and handwriting samples resembling known Romanov family members. Were these expertly manufactured or relics smuggled out of Russia decades earlier? No one could say for certain. In the closing months of 1942, the mystery took an even darker turn. A courier affiliated with the White Fellowship was found dead near Luleå, his body half buried in snow. Among his effects was a page torn from a 1918 diary, written in French, signed A. The paper matched the stationery used by Grand Duchess Anastasia before the revolution. Handwriting experts were divided. Some called it a forgery, others weren't so sure. For MI6, it no longer mattered whether the Romanov legend was real or fabricated. The belief itself had power, and in wartime, belief could move nations. As Fleming's final report concluded, "If the Germans succeed in resurrecting a ghost, the Soviets will see a dagger behind every shadow. But if the ghost is real, then history has a longer memory than any of us imagined." The findings were sent to London under highest classification. Eyes only, Prime Minister. Churchill's reaction was terse. His notes scribbled in red pencil continued discreetly. If true, this may undo Stalin. If false, it must remain buried. And so, the operation expanded, drawing the Allies deeper into a web of deception that stretched from Helsinki's frozen docks to the heart of Nazi Germany. Somewhere in the north, perhaps in a forgotten village or a captured train, the ghost of Russia's imperial past waited to be found, or exposed as the grandest illusion of the war. Next, the search would move to the unforgiving frontiers of Finland, where intelligence, myth, and survival would collide. By early 1943, Finland stood at the crossroads of empires, allied with Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union, yet never fully a fascist state. It became the perfect stage for covert operations. Beneath the frozen forests and northern lights, armies clashed in silence, and in the shadows, another war unfolded. This was not a war of tanks or artillery, but of secrets, code names, and vanishing identities. It was here, in this frozen liminal zone, that British and American intelligence sought the truth behind a name that refused to die: the Romanovs. Captain Peter Fleming of the Special Operations Executive, now embedded within the British military mission to Finland, had become increasingly obsessed with the rumours first intercepted in Stockholm. Alongside OSS liaison Major John Haskell, he operated under the cover of the Anglo-Finnish Timber Exchange, a legitimate front supplying industrial materials to the British war effort. Their real mission, however, was to track down whispers of a mysterious figure known in coded German messages as Der Erbe, the heir. The first credible lead came from Rovaniemi, a remote town in Lapland serving as a logistical hub for German forces. Local Finnish intelligence reported a convoy that had arrived from Norway in late 1942, carrying special cargo under SS escort. The description of one passenger, a middle-aged man, Russian in appearance, guarded but treated with extraordinary deference, piqued Fleming's attention. Officially, the convoy was transporting scientific equipment. Unofficially, it was rumored to be part of an Abwehr psychological operation known as Unternehmen Schattenbild, Project Shadow Image. Fleming and Haskell's challenge was immense. Finland, though technically an ally, did not trust British intelligence, and German forces controlled key northern routes. Their only advantage was the network of Finnish resistance figures sympathetic to Western powers. Men like Lieutenant Arne Leitinen of the Finnish Intelligence Division, who quietly believed that Germany's ambitions would doom his country. Leitinen provided access to German movement logs and, more importantly, a trail leading toward Lake Inari, a desolate, ice-choked expanse near the Arctic Circle. In February 1943, under cover of the polar night, the small Allied team embarked north by sled convoy. The journey was brutal. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees, and their wireless operator nearly lost a hand to frostbite. Yet, as Fleming recorded in his field notes, the silence of this land conceals everything, truth and deception alike. They reached a village called Sevettijärvi, where local Sami herders reported German patrols guarding a stone house by the lake. One man claimed to have seen a bearded foreigner escorted inside under heavy guard. The stranger, he said, spoke Russian, but prayed in the old tongue. The team's reconnaissance revealed a small, fortified structure camouflaged against the frozen hillside, its guards wearing SS armbands with the insignia of Sonderkommando 1005 WWII, a unit typically associated with the erasure of evidence from mass executions. What was such a detachment doing in the Finnish wilderness, hundreds of miles from any battlefield? Fleming's group managed to intercept a supply runner heading toward the compound. Among his papers was a coded manifest referencing Subject R to be transferred via Narvik to Danzig, pending Führer approval. Fleming immediately recognized the danger. If the Nazis were moving a living claimant to the Russian throne, real or fabricated, toward Germany, it could be used as a powerful propaganda instrument. "We are no longer chasing ghosts," he wrote. "We are chasing a weapon." But then everything unraveled. During a night reconnaissance, the team stumbled upon a German patrol. In the ensuing skirmish, their translator was wounded, and radio contact with British command was lost. For 3 days they hid in the wilderness, pursued by dogs and aircraft. When they finally returned to Sevettijärvi, the stone house had been burned to the ground. Every document, every trace of its occupants, gone. Only a few charred fragments remained. Among them a silver Orthodox cross bearing the Romanov crest. The find sent ripples through Allied intelligence. Bletchley Park analysts authenticated the crest but noted that thousands of such relics had been looted during the revolution. Still, Fleming was convinced. "Someone wanted us to find this," he told Haskell. "And someone else wanted to erase it." Declassified SOE communications from March 1943 reveal that London grew increasingly nervous about the implications. A surviving Romanov, whether genuine or constructed, could not only destabilize Soviet morale, but threaten the fragile Allied alliance itself. Yet Churchill's directive was clear. Do not provoke Stalin. Continue covert verification only. The mission went black. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Heinrich Himmler's personal files began referencing Operation Feuervogel, the Firebird, a rumored plan to unveil a Russian monarch as a puppet ruler of occupied territories. The project was shelved after Stalingrad, but traces of its planning persisted in intelligence reports well into 1944. Historians later speculated that the Lapland compound may have been connected to this program, a failed psychological warfare experiment. Fleming and Haskell were extracted via Murmansk in April 1943, under diplomatic cover, carrying only fragments: the cross, a coded map of northern Norway, and a single torn photograph of a man whose face was mostly obscured by shadow. The inscription on the back read simply, "To my guardian in Tobolsk, 1918. Was it genuine? A forgery? The Allies never determined the truth. The photograph vanished into British archives, sealed under the classification Ultra Black. Fleming never forgot the mission. In his post-war papers, he wrote, "It is not the dead who haunt history. It is the questions we are forbidden to ask." And though the team returned home, the trail was far from over. The Soviets soon learned of Western intelligence probing into Romanov myths, and they did not take it lightly. By late 1943, the question of a surviving heir was no longer a curiosity. It had become a liability, a threat to be extinguished before it could fracture the alliance that was holding Hitler at bay. The next chapter of the story would unfold in conference rooms and code-breaking centers, where politics, secrecy, and fear collided. As the Allies planned their next moves in the war, Stalin's own agencies were already hunting the truth. And in the darkness of Moscow's archives, Operation Veil was about to begin. By the spring of 1943, the war in Europe was turning. The Red Army had triumphed at Stalingrad, and the Nazi advance was breaking under the weight of Soviet counterattacks. But beneath the victory banners, Joseph Stalin's paranoia deepened. The Soviet leader, ever distrustful of his allies, began to hear whispers of a Western conspiracy involving a Romanov pretender. Whether born from British espionage, Nazi propaganda, or his own fear of betrayal, those whispers would ignite one of the most secretive operations of the war, Operation Veil. It began with a report from the NKVD station in Stockholm. Soviet counterintelligence had intercepted fragments of British and American transmissions referencing the Air and Operation Legacy. At first, Moscow assumed it to be code for an Allied supply route or a deception plan. But when the name Romanov surfaced in an intercepted OSS message to London, alarm bells rang through the Kremlin. Stalin's instruction was immediate and absolute. Find it, erase it, silence all who speak of it. Inside the Lubyanka, the NKVD's headquarters in Moscow, Director Lavrenti Beria assembled a special committee to investigate. Files once considered myth were reopened, including the 1918 Yekaterinburg case documents. Cross-reference reports revealed inconsistencies in the Romanov burial accounts, incomplete witness testimonies, and the mysterious disappearance of several guards who had served at the Ipatiev house. One of those guards, Yakov Yurovsky, had reportedly recanted parts of his statement before dying under suspicious circumstances in 1938. Beria's analysts drew a chilling conclusion. There was a possibility, however slim, that one or more Romanov children had survived. To Stalin, this wasn't just history, it was potential sedition. If the Western Allies were cultivating the myth of a surviving heir, it could fracture Soviet unity, particularly among officers with Tsarist sympathies. The propaganda value alone made it a threat. Thus, Operation Veil was launched, a campaign of surveillance, suppression, and disinformation designed to bury the Romanov question once and for all. While British and American agents debated the authenticity of their leads in Finland, Soviet operatives moved quickly to neutralize the story. Between May and July 1943, several known White Russian émigré figures in Stockholm, Helsinki, and Istanbul were found dead under unexplained circumstances. Officially, the deaths were blamed on wartime chaos. Unofficially, they bore the unmistakable mark of NKVD wet work, cyanide, garrots, and staged accidents. At the same time, Soviet diplomatic channels began pressing Churchill and Roosevelt to disavow any monarchist projects aimed at undermining the USSR. A secret cable from Moscow to the British Foreign Office warned, "Such illusions belong to the grave with the Romanovs. To resurrect them is to betray the alliance." Churchill, aware that the Soviets were indispensable for the coming invasion of Europe, quietly ordered the MI6 investigation shelved. "Let sleeping ghosts lie," he reportedly told his aide. Yet, the Americans were less willing to let go. Within the OSS, Director William Wild Bill Donovan authorized a continuation of the inquiry under deep cover. Using neutral Sweden and Switzerland as hubs, agents were tasked with tracing financial accounts linked to the defunct Russian imperial family. One such account, discovered in Geneva's Banque de Commerce, showed deposits made as late as 1937, signed May Alexandrovich. The possibility that funds from the old dynasty still circulated was too tantalizing to ignore. To protect these findings from Soviet detection, the OSS encrypted all Romanov-related communications under the codename Project Lantern. Ironically, the NKVD soon intercepted those messages as well, misinterpreting them as evidence of an Anglo-American plot to install a puppet government in post-war Russia. Stalin's fury grew. "They are preparing to crown their own Tsar," he told Beria in a closed session of the State Defense Committee. "Before they do, we will bury the idea forever." Throughout late 1943, Operation Veil expanded beyond the intelligence community. Soviet cultural censors ordered the destruction of pre-revolutionary archives, church records, and aristocratic genealogies. Museums were raided, and any document referencing Romanov heirs vanished from public access. In a chilling directive, Beria instructed his agents, "Remove the shadow, and no one will remember the light." Meanwhile, Allied cooperation became increasingly strained. During the Tehran Conference in November 1943, Stalin privately confronted Churchill about imperialist whisperings regarding Russia's monarchy. Churchill dismissed the notion as absurd, but made a mental note of how precisely Stalin knew the code names of operations supposedly unknown to the Soviets. Intelligence leaks were now certain. After Tehran, all Western inquiries into the Romanov mystery ceased, officially at least. But unofficially, OSS analysts in Washington continued to receive fragments of information from field agents in Sweden and Norway. One report described a Soviet cleanup team operating near the same Arctic route where Fleming's SOE unit had vanished earlier that year. Their orders were explicit: eliminate all witnesses and destroy any remnants connected to the false heir. When the Red Army liberated Finland in 1944, those orders became literal. Soviet security forces swept through the countryside, detaining locals suspected of aiding Western spies. Entire villages were questioned about foreigners seen near Lake Inari. None admitted to anything, but several disappeared shortly afterward. By the end of the year, every known trace of the so-called Eagle of Tobolsk had been erased. Yet, in the process of burying the truth, Operation Veil left behind faint, incriminating fingerprints. A handful of NKVD documents, declassified decades later, referenced Target R and Subject Cross. One field report mentioned a shipment of personal effects sent to Moscow from Murmansk in May 1943. Among them, a silver Orthodox cross engraved with the Romanov crest, the same cross Captain Fleming had reported finding before his extraction. To this day, no one knows what happened to that artifact. Soviet records list it as transferred to Lubyanka storage, and then nothing. No further mention. For the Soviets, the Romanov question had been successfully erased from wartime discourse. But for Western intelligence, the silence spoke volumes. Had Stalin suppressed a myth or concealed a truth too dangerous to reveal? By the war's final years, the lines between propaganda, paranoia, and reality had blurred beyond recognition. As the Allies prepared for D-Day and the liberation of Europe, a quiet battle over history itself raged beneath the surface. And when the guns of 1944 began to thunder across the continent, the question of the Romanov legacy was far from over. In the closing phase of the war, the Soviets would ensure that any trace of that royal bloodline, real or imagined, was erased from living memory. But history, as always, leaves its fingerprints. And when the Red Army reached Berlin, fragments began to resurface in the most unexpected of places. Spring 1944. The tide of war had turned irrevocably against the Reich. The Red Army advanced through Ukraine and Belarus, driving the Wehrmacht back toward Poland. In the shadow of the front lines, another, quieter campaign was underway. One not fought with tanks or artillery, but with silence, censorship, and fear. Its codename was Operation Veil, and its purpose was simple: to erase all traces of the Romanov question from existence. Inside the NKVD headquarters in Moscow, Lavrenti Beria reviewed reports from field commanders. Stalin's directive was unambiguous: the myth must die with the war. That myth, the possibility that a member of Russia's last royal family had escaped the Yekaterinburg massacre, had grown from rumor to geopolitical liability. Western intelligence had pursued it for years. Nazi Germany had tried to weaponize it. And now, as victory neared, Stalin wanted it buried forever. Soviet counterintelligence fanned out across Eastern Europe, routing through archives, monasteries, and émigré communities. The NKVD's Third Directorate, the same unit responsible for anti-partisan warfare, was reassigned to track down individuals suspected of spreading monarchist stories. In Warsaw, a priest was arrested for imperialist collaboration after claiming to have heard confession from a Romanov survivor. In Bucharest, an Orthodox bishop was found dead under mysterious circumstances, his church library burned to ashes. Officially, both incidents were attributed to wartime chaos. Unofficially, they were part of the cleanup. Meanwhile, the British and Americans had all but abandoned their earlier investigations. The fragile alliance with Stalin depended on cooperation for D-Day and Operation Overlord. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill issued an internal memo instructing MI6 to cease all activities which might invite Soviet distrust. Yet within the intelligence community, curiosity lingered. Declassified memos from 1944 show that several agents, particularly those within the OSS's Russian section, continued to monitor legacy rumors out of personal fascination. One such agent, Lieutenant Robert C. Danvers, wrote in his April 1944 field journal, "There is too much smoke to deny the existence of a fire. The Soviets' obsession with erasing this legend only strengthens the belief that it hides something real." His message, sent from Stockholm, was among the last OSS cables to reference the Romanov question before the end of the war. The NKVD, however, had no intention of leaving loose ends. Through neutral channels, they tracked émigré networks across Scandinavia and Western Europe. In July 1944, a Soviet operative using the alias Kuznetsov arrived in Oslo, posing as a Red Cross liaison. Within weeks, several White Russian exiles were detained and deported under Norwegian neutrality violations. Among their possessions were family records dating back to 1918, including a faded photograph labeled Mikhail, Arkhangelsk. 1920, all materials were confiscated and never seen again. At the same time, Soviet propagandists launched a campaign to discredit any surviving monarchist movements. In the pages of Pravda and Izvestia, editorials ridiculed Western fairy tales of Romanov survival, framing them as fascist propaganda meant to destabilize the unity of the Soviet people. "The Tsar and his children are bones in the ground," one article declared. And even their bones serve the people now, but beneath the bravado, fear remained. NKVD documents reveal that Stalin personally demanded verification of all burial sites associated with the Romanov executions. Excavation reports from the early 1940s, classified top secret, claimed to have confirmed the remains. Yet discrepancies persisted. Missing bones, incomplete remains, and inconsistent testimony from the original guards. These anomalies fueled a quiet panic among Soviet historians assigned to the investigation. "Comrade Stalin," one official report read, "the evidence is conclusive, but not absolute." That lack of absolution haunted the Kremlin. In September 1944, the NKVD initiated the final phase of Operation Veil, the purging of archives. Documents pertaining to the imperial family's last years, the White Army evacuation routes, and any record of foreign inquiries were destroyed or sealed indefinitely. Some witnesses were transferred to psychiatric hospitals under fabricated diagnoses, others simply disappeared. The erasure was so thorough that post-war Soviet scholars would later insist no such records had ever existed. And yet, fragments survived. In late 1944, as the Red Army swept into the Baltic states, a Soviet major reportedly discovered a crate of personal effects in Riga's Gestapo archives. Inside were items catalogued under Abwehr psychological operations, including an ornate silver cross bearing the Romanov double-headed eagle. It was identical to the one recovered by the British team in Finland the previous year. The NKVD confiscated the find, labeling it recovered fascist propaganda material, and shipped it to Moscow for disposal. Its fate, like so many artifacts of that shadow war, remains unknown. For the men who carried out Stalin's order, Operation Veil was more than a campaign. It was an act of rewriting history. "We are not burning lies," one NKVD officer later recalled in interrogation. "We are burning temptations. The dead must remain dead, or the living will start asking questions." By early 1945, those questions had indeed been silenced. The last whispers of Romanov survival vanished beneath the roar of Soviet artillery as Berlin itself fell. The Allies, preoccupied with liberation and reconstruction, allowed the myth to fade into obscurity. For decades, official Soviet history would insist that the Ipatiev House executions were absolute, final, and witnessed by history. But history is never so obedient. In the ruins of Berlin, amid crates of looted archives and burned propaganda, Allied intelligence officers would stumble upon documents that suggested a deeper, older story, one that refused to die. Among the smouldering papers recovered by the OSS in May 1945 was a reference to Subject Romanov, secured via Northern Corridor. 1942. The file was incomplete, charred, and unsigned. No one ever claimed authorship, but its existence raised the same haunting question that had stalked the war from the beginning. Was the story of the Romanovs truly finished? Or had it merely been rewritten? As Europe celebrated the end of its bloodiest war, a few silent men in intelligence offices across London, Washington, and Moscow understood the truth. Some victories are won not on battlefields, but in the erasure of memory. The guns were silent now, but the ghosts of the past had not been laid to rest. And in the rubble of the Reich, history was about to whisper once more. Berlin, May 1945. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. The Reich lay in ruins, and the victors divided the spoils of a shattered continent. Amid the smoke and rubble, Allied intelligence officers combed through the wreckage of ministries, safe houses and bunkers, searching not just for Nazi officials, but for the documents they had left behind. Files that told stories of occupation, collaboration, and secrets buried deeper than the graves of soldiers. Among them was a folder marked only with a black eagle and the words, Project Waldkönig. The folder contained fragments of German intelligence reports referencing a political instrument of dynastic origin. Within those pages were familiar names, Romanov, Alexandrovich, and the code phrase, Eagle of Tobolsk. The same legend that British and American operatives had pursued since 1941 seemed to resurface amid the ashes of the Third Reich. No one in the Allied command knew quite what to make of it. The prevailing theory was that the Nazis had attempted to fabricate a living Romanov heir as a tool of psychological warfare against Stalin. But scattered among the propaganda materials were documents that did not fit. Handwritten letters, photographs, and fragments of diaries bearing imperial insignia not seen since before the revolution. OSS officer Captain John Haskell, the same man who had once followed the trail through the snows of Finland, was among those assigned to sift through these materials. He described the discovery in his debriefing. We found evidence of an operation designed to create or conceal a royal figurehead. Whether the subject was genuine or constructed remains unclear, but someone went to great lengths to ensure his existence, or his disappearance, was never confirmed. At the same time, the British Army's Intelligence Corps recovered a set of sealed crates from the ruins of a Gestapo records building near Potsdam. Inside were archival materials from occupied Norway, among them a small notebook written in French and Russian. It was dated 1928 and signed only A. One entry read, I dream of the palace at Tsarskoye Selo. I am told never to speak of my name. Handwriting experts could not agree on its authenticity, but the discovery reignited debate within Allied intelligence. Was this the same diary fragment found on the frozen body of the courier in Sweden 3 years earlier, or another carefully placed illusion? As Europe fell under Allied occupation, questions multiplied faster than answers. Soviet troops, now entrenched in Eastern Europe, swiftly claimed possession of any material tied to the Romanov name. NKVD officers reportedly confiscated crates of documents from Berlin safe houses before Western investigators could examine them. When American officers demanded access, Soviet command insisted the files were fascist fabrications. Yet months later, rumors spread among Allied personnel that some of those crates had been shipped directly to the Lubyanka prison in Moscow, the same location where the Romanov cross had disappeared a year before. In London, the Foreign Office classified all surviving Romanov-related correspondence under the file heading. Closed subject. Churchill, preparing for the Potsdam Conference, viewed the legend as a dangerous distraction. He wrote privately to Anthony Eden, "Let the dead rest in the Ural earth. The living have nations to rebuild." But others, like the historian and intelligence consultant Hugh Trevor Roper, were less certain. He argued that the persistence of the legend across enemy intelligence networks suggested a kernel of truth. The same story, retold by enemies who trust no one, he noted in his post-war memorandum, is rarely coincidence. Meanwhile, in Washington, the newly formed Central Intelligence Group, the forerunner of the CIA, quietly inherited the OSS's Romanov files. Analysts reviewed the materials with a fresh post-war lens. To their surprise, several leads extended well into the late 1930s, tracing émigré financial transfers through Swiss and Swedish banks. One account, under the alias Mikhail A., remained active until 1946. When an American agent tried to trace the funds, the account was abruptly closed by private instruction. The Swiss clerk who handled the closure died in a car accident 2 weeks later. Was it all coincidence or the echo of something deliberately concealed? In the Soviet Union, Stalin ensured the story never resurfaced. The Ipatiev house, where the Romanovs were said to have been executed, was placed under NKVD control and quietly demolished in the 1970s, long after the war's end. Official Soviet historiography declared the case closed, the executions absolute, the remains irrecoverable. But behind closed doors, files labeled Special Archive 17 remained sealed for decades, accessible only to a handful of senior officials. When those archives were finally opened after the fall of the USSR, researchers found heavily redacted pages, missing photographs, and an entire section of correspondence between Soviet intelligence and captured German officers mysteriously absent. The Cold War soon swallowed the legend entirely. In the age of atomic diplomacy and espionage, the question of a long-dead royal family seemed irrelevant, until, in 1958, a Soviet defector in Vienna claimed to have seen an imperial child alive in northern Russia in 1947, under NKVD protection. Western intelligence dismissed him as unreliable. Still, his account matched elements of reports buried deep in British files from 1943. The ghost of the Romanovs, it seemed, refused to rest. By the time the Iron Curtain fell, most of those who had pursued the story were gone. Peter Fleming retired to the English countryside, never speaking publicly of his wartime missions. Major Haskell left intelligence work, but his personal papers, donated posthumously to the US National Archives, contained a single envelope marked Tobolsk. Inside was the faded photograph of a man standing beside a frozen lake. The inscription read, "My Guardian, 1918. No one knows who took it or when. Today, historians still debate whether the Romanov escape was a myth engineered by propagandists or a suppressed truth that threatened the world's post-war balance. What remains undeniable is how far nations went to conceal, distort, or weaponize the legend. Intelligence, after all, is not only the art of discovering secrets, but of deciding which truths must never be found. As the camera lingers on archival footage of ruined cities and fading photographs, the narrator's voice would lower, the tone solemn. In war, victory belongs to those who control the narrative. Perhaps the greatest secret of the Romanovs is not whether they lived or died, but how history chose to remember them. The final image fades to black, the words appearing on screen. Operation Veil, declassified 1992. Romanov case files, status inconclusive. And with that, the curtain closes, not on a solved mystery, but on one that will forever stand between history and myth, where truth itself became a casualty of war.